If you open a map of California and look about 30 miles west of San Francisco, you'll see the Farallon Islands. That's not far at all when you're talking about the ocean. A regular ship can cover that in a couple of hours, and on the map, the water between the city and those islands looks completely open. No tight passages, no obvious hazards, just a straight stretch of ocean. Now, here's what matters. The entrance to San Francisco Bay is one of the busiest on the West Coast. Ships move through here all the time. Containers, fuel, construction materials, food. On top of that, there's constant traffic running north and south along the Pacific coast. This isn't some side route for small boats. It's a major shipping lane. So if you're a captain coming down the coast, the shortest path seems obvious. Cut between the mainland and the islands instead of heading farther out into open water. That saves fuel, it saves time. And in shipping, that matters, especially in the past, when schedules were tight and every mile counted. But here's the strange part. This stretch of water built a reputation over time. 100 years ago, navigation wasn't as precise as it is today, and even a small mistake could turn serious fast. The section that looks easiest on a map ended up being one of the most difficult in real life. So the real question isn't whether ships can pass between the islands and the mainland. Technically, they can. The question is, why a place that looks like a simple shortcut at the entrance to a major port ended up being known as a stretch of water ships are better off avoiding. When a ship is moving along the coast, the most stressful part is usually out there in the open ocean. That's where people expect trouble. Storms, long stretches at sea, that's where everyone stays alert. But once the shoreline comes into view, everything changes. People on board feel like the trip is almost over. The captain is already thinking about entering the harbor. The crew starts preparing for arrival. There's a sense that the hardest part is behind them, and it's usually in moments like that when something strange happens. When you're no longer in the big ocean, but almost home, vigilance starts to fade. Everything looks familiar. There's the coast, there are landmarks. You feel like you've got it under control. The area near the entrance to San Francisco Bay creates exactly that feeling. You don't feel isolated. You see the city, the port, regular traffic. It feels normal. But this is exactly where things went wrong. Not out in the middle of the Pacific, not during some extreme storm, right here on the final stretch of the route, close to port. And what makes it even more confusing is that, at first glance, there's nothing about this place that looks especially dangerous. And here's a real example of when everything should have been safe, but wasn't. On the morning of February 22, 1901, the steamship City of Rio de Janeiro was approaching San Francisco after a long trip across the Pacific. The ship had come from Hong Kong. On board were hundreds of people, crew members, passengers, entire families. They had already crossed the ocean. The longest and most dangerous part of the journey was behind them. Only a few miles remained before entering the bay. This wasn't a ship fighting massive waves in the middle of nowhere. This was the final stretch. The captain was guiding the vessel toward the harbor. Passengers were thinking about stepping onto land. After weeks at sea, they were almost there. And then, impact. The ship struck a submerged reef not far from the entrance to the bay. The damage was severe. Water began pouring into the hull almost immediately. Everything happened fast, so fast that there was barely time for an organized evacuation. According to official reports, more than 100 people died. This happened not in the middle of the Pacific, not during a huge storm, but just a few miles from shore. And this is where it's important to clear something up. The captain of the City of Rio de Janeiro wasn't doing anything reckless. He was doing what many captains before him had done. The coastal route and the approach to San Francisco were well known. Ships had been using that path for decades. If you're sailing down the California coast and heading into the bay, the most obvious thing to do is stay closer to the mainland and the islands instead of heading farther out into open water. The reason is simple. It's shorter. And in shipping, every mile matters. Fewer miles mean less time. Less time means less fuel and lower costs. Especially in the early 1900s, when voyages were long and shipping depended heavily on staying on schedule. It also wasn't some secret or forbidden route. Other ships used it. It was considered normal. Captains could see the coastline. They knew the area. They relied on the charts available at the time. From their perspective, the decision made sense. So it wasn't stupid or careless. It was logical. A captain who had just crossed thousands of miles of open ocean was on the final stretch of the trip. He did what many others had done and trusted that the route was safe if handled carefully. And the strangest part of the whole story is the location of the wreck. It didn't happen in the middle of the ocean. It happened right near the entrance to the harbor the ship had been heading toward for weeks. That's when it became clear that the problem wasn't the open Pacific. It was here, on the stretch of water that looks the simplest on the map. But under the surface, it's a different story. Around the Farallon Islands and closer to the mainland, there are rocks and reefs scattered under the water. Some stick above the surface, many don't. Some sit just low enough that you won't notice them unless waves are breaking over them. On a calm, clear day, you might spot that. In poor visibility, you won't see anything at all. There's another thing going on here. The depth in this area doesn't change slowly. In one spot, there may be plenty of water under the ship. Move a little to the side, and it suddenly gets much shallower. That doesn't mean ships are squeezing through some narrow canyon. There's still a lot of open water. But if a vessel drifts even a little off the safest line, it can end up much closer to rock than the captain realizes. And that's hard to judge just by looking. When you see the islands from a distance, they often seem farther away than they really are. The coastline looks calm and easy to read. But in low visibility, judging distance becomes much harder than people expect. A small mistake can suddenly matter a lot. So you end up with a strange situation. The water looks wide and open. It doesn't feel like you're entering some tight passage. But the safe space out there isn't as big as it seems from the deck. And yeah, there's the fog. The coast of Northern California is known for heavy fog. A cold ocean current runs along the shoreline and meets warmer air, and that's how thick marine fog forms here. Sometimes it rolls in fast and hangs around for hours. Visibility can drop so much that from the deck, you can't see the islands. Sometimes you can't even see the coastline. For a modern ship with radar, that's a problem, but it's manageable. 100 years ago, it was different. When the fog rolled in, your visual landmarks disappeared. You couldn't see how close you were to the islands. You couldn't see waves breaking over rocks. You couldn't judge distance by eye. And that's when things start to make more sense. There are rocks and reefs under the surface. The water looks wider than it really is. The port is only a few miles away, and it feels like everything is under control. And then the fog rolls in. Fog by itself doesn't sink ships. It doesn't create reefs or move rocks, but it takes away the one thing captains depended on most, the ability to see a mistake before it becomes serious. If the course is off just a little more than it should be, the captain might not realize it in time. There's another thing people don't usually think about: wind. Along this stretch of coast, steady winds often blow in from the Pacific. They're not always storms, but they're strong enough to slowly push a large ship off course. It's not a sudden shove. It happens gradually. The ship keeps moving forward, but it starts drifting a little to the side. Of course, the captain corrects for that. But when you're running closer to the islands, you have less room to make those corrections. And if visibility is poor, or the current is also pushing the ship the same way, steering suddenly takes a lot more attention. Then there are the waves. A big ship isn't bouncing up and down out there, but the movement still isn't perfectly steady. The vessel keeps shifting a little, so the captain has to keep adjusting the course. Over distance, those small corrections start to matter. If you stay a bit farther out in open water, you've got more room around you. If wind or waves push the ship slightly off course, it's not a big deal. But if you're hugging the shortest line near the islands, even a small drift starts eating into your safety margin. And that's where we need to clear something up. Today, ships are very different. Captains have GPS, electronic charts, radar, depth sounders. The ship's position shows up on a screen very precisely, and the depth under the keel can be checked at any moment. Even in thick fog, a modern vessel isn't moving completely blind, the way ships did 100 years ago. So it might seem like, with all that technology, ships could simply follow the shortest line between the mainland and the islands. And technically they can. In good conditions, modern vessels can pass through this area without much trouble. But if you look at actual shipping routes, most large ships still stay a bit farther west, away from the islands. They don't hug the shortest path, even though their equipment would allow it. The reason is simple. The geography hasn't changed. The rocks under the water are still there. The reefs are in the same places they were a century ago. And the fog still rolls in along this coastline from time to time. Technology gives captains more control, but it doesn't change the environment. Out at sea, the rule is to leave yourself some margin. Even with precise navigation, it's better to have more open water around you than to depend on perfect conditions. So even today, ships approaching the bay usually stay off the tightest line. Yeah, modern technology has made this area safer, but it still demands attention. And in fact, there's one more reason ships tend to avoid this stretch of water. The Farallon Islands aren't just a few rocks sitting out in the ocean. The whole area around them is part of a protected zone called the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. It's a federally protected marine area. In practice, that means ship traffic around the islands is regulated. There are zones where vessels are expected to keep their distance, especially large commercial ships. The goal is to protect wildlife, seabirds, sea lions, seals, and the whale migration routes that pass through this area. Ships aren't completely banned from passing nearby, but there are recommended distances and traffic lanes that guide vessels a bit farther away from the islands. This helps reduce the risk of ships hitting whales, lowers underwater noise, and protects the surrounding ecosystem. At the same time, major shipping routes do pass through this region, but they're organized so ships move in predictable lanes instead of crossing each other randomly. And those lanes don't follow the shortest straight line between the mainland and the islands. So even if you ignore the reefs and the fog, the traffic system itself naturally pushes ships a little farther west. It's not a coincidence or some old maritime myth. That's simply how modern shipping routes work. In the end, it creates an interesting situation. Today, ships often stay farther out because the routes are designed that way. 100 years ago, captains stayed farther out because of the risks. And the reason wasn't that captains lacked skill. It had a lot to do with the ships themselves. To understand why this was especially dangerous 100 or 200 years ago, you have to remember how navigation actually worked back then. Captains didn't have GPS, electronic charts, or screens showing the ship's exact position. Everything was done by hand. A ship's position was estimated using the sun, the stars, and time. The course was drawn on a paper chart, and from there, a lot depended on how accurate the calculations were. And those methods always had some margin of error. You could misread an angle, you could be slightly off on the timing. You might not fully account for current or wind. Out in the open ocean, that usually didn't matter much. There were hundreds of miles of water in every direction. But when the coast was only about 30 miles away, things changed. An error of just a couple of degrees over that distance could push a ship quite a bit off its intended line. By the time the vessel reached the area near the islands, it might already be drifting left or right of the safest path. And if there are reefs and rocks under the water in that area, even a small shift can be enough to cause a wreck. Add fog that hides visual landmarks, and you start to see how much depended on precise navigation. A captain could be experienced, the route could be familiar, but the system itself never gave complete certainty. So when complex underwater terrain, thick fog, and navigation with built-in uncertainty all came together in the same place, the risk went up quickly. That's the strange thing about this area. On the surface, it looked simple, but in practice, it demanded accuracy. And back then, accuracy was never guaranteed. Over time, captains started drawing some conclusions. After several well-known wrecks, it became clear that following the shortest line wasn't always the best choice. Many began staying a bit farther west, giving the islands and the coastline more room. That meant sailing a few extra miles out into open water before turning toward the entrance of the bay. In terms of distance, it wasn't a big difference, but in terms of safety, it gave ships more space. If the course drifted slightly or visibility suddenly dropped, there was more water under the keel and more time to correct the mistake. Gradually, the routes shifted. Charts began showing clearer guidance on where it was safer to pass. Captains started treating the final stretch of the trip with the same level of attention they gave the open ocean, instead of thinking of it as the easy part of the voyage. It wasn't panic, and it wasn't some belief that the place was cursed. It was simple maritime logic. It's better to spend a little more time and fuel than to risk a ship and the lives on board just to save a few miles. And in the end, that became the practical solution. The reefs didn't disappear. The fog didn't stop rolling in. What changed was how people approached the area. Ships simply stopped treating this stretch of water as an easy shortcut.